Hello and welcome everyone. In this chapter, we are going to discuss about DTP, Dynamic Trunking Protocol. So far, we have discussed about trunk in detail in our previous chapter. And we discussed like we can make use of the ISL or dot one q, these two protocols for the trunking, where the dot one q is the mostly and widely used protocol which we have discussed, not ISL. Okay, so when it comes to this trunk method which we have seen in our previous video, that is basically a manual methods to form the trunk between the switches. We do have the dynamic way to form the trunk between the switches as well, and that's where we have the protocol which is known as dynamic trunking protocol. DTP is the dynamic trunking protocol, and this DTP can form the trunk between the switches dynamically, and the protocol which is going to used here by default, that will be dot one q only. Okay, so let us try and understand a bit more detail about the same. So far, when I take the example of the switches here, let's say we have a switch here, and we have got another switch here, and normally switch has the port here, and to this ports of course we know that we can go ahead and connect our end users, is all about uh, your computers which can be connected here like this. When it comes to the communications between the switches, again we'll be using the port here, and the same port will be there. You can say we'll connect a switch to switch connection here. This will be your switch to switch connection, and here in this switch 1 and in switch 2 also, the DTP protocol is running by default. DTP protocol says that I will go ahead and negotiate the trunk between the switches by default. That's the major point. Now what's the reason of it? So of course we need to understand what is the actual reason behind that. First of all, DTP, as we discussed, it's a dynamic trunking protocol which has something called as mode, DTP mode, and this DTP mode itself defines the dynamic nature of the protocol here. And the modes are like this. The modes can be dynamic desirable, or dynamic auto. This is only the mode which you can have, dynamic desirable or dynamic auto. So for example, let's say if it is dynamic desirable and this is also dynamic desirable, dynamic desirable both the side, in the sense dynamic desirable initiates the message to form the trunk. This also initiates the message to form the trunk, just like a hello packet. If both the switches are negotiating to each other, they will go for trunk. Even if you go for this as well, say for example, one side dynamic desirable and another side we have, let's say, dynamic auto. So dynamic desirable is saying I want to form a trunk. Auto will passively wait to neighbor. So neighbor is already negotiating and saying that hey, I want to form the trunk here. So auto will say okay, let's go for that. Passively wait neighbor to negotiate for trunk. This is the behavior of your dynamic desirable and auto. Okay, so that's what the major point we need to remember. Okay, so let's say dynamic desirable and dynamic auto, of course it is going to form the trunk. So say for example, this is my switch 1 and this is my switch 2. In switch 1, dynamic desirable or dynamic auto you can have. In switch 2 also you can have, let's say, dynamic desirable or dynamic auto. So far you have one more thing you need to remember, the port mode. If you remember, which is something called as manually we can configure a port to work like a trunk, and manually we can configure a port to work like a access port. So in switch 2 this can be the mode, in switch on also this can be the mode, like I'll make it like trunk and then access. Okay, So let's say the behavior, what it will be. Say for example, in switch 1, it is dynamic desirable. In switch 2 also, it is dynamic desirable. So of course, they are going to form trunk. They will form the trunk. In switch 1, dynamic desirable, switch 2, dynamic auto. Definitely they are going to form the trunk. Correct? Dynamic desirable is saying that I want to form a trunk, and let's say switch 2 is already working as a trunk. Then it will say, you want to form a trunk, I am already working as a trunk, let's go for trunk. So they will form the trunk here as well. I want to form a trunk, but I am working as a static access. Access in the sense it will not change the mode because this is static. So now what happens? There is no trunk between the switches in this case. Similarly, go for other combinations here, like you have dynamic desirable and dynamic auto. Yes, they will form the trunk. Dynamic desirable, dynamic auto and dynamic auto, auto, no, they will not form trunk because nobody is initiating, both are waiting. Dynamic auto and trunk, yes, they will form the trunk. Okay, they are going to form the trunk. Dynamic auto and access, no trunk, they will work like access. Trunk, dynamic desirable, they will form the trunk. Trunk and auto, it is already working as a trunk, it is going to wait. So neighbor is saying form a trunk, it will form the trunk. Trunk, of course, yes, it is trunk. Trunk, access, no trunk here, they will work like a access. Access, dynamic desirable, it will work like a access port only, means no trunk. Access, dynamic auto, in the sense access cannot change the mode, it will always work like a access port only, means no trunk, no trunk, no trunk, they will work like a access port only. So this is basically the combination which we need to remember, that if you are having a switch like this, the ports can have the roles of this, and you can find where they are forming the trunk and where not. Okay. Make sure DTP is one of the Cisco proprietary protocol which is by default enabled in the Cisco switches, and it will negotiate the trunk by itself because the default state of your port will be in dynamic desirable state, either dynamic auto state, anyone. Okay, so most of the time dynamic desirable and sometime dynamic auto you can get, depends upon the series of switches it will be there, but yes, they will be in dynamic state only. So this is how your DTP and DTP works. Okay, so just a quick a reference to slide deck as well, that's very important. Let's move ahead and see that, but this is very important, you need to remember this scenario. Okay, let's move ahead. Say this. So as we discussed, DTP is the Cisco proprietary protocol, of course, yes, and DTP is responsible for dynamically negotiate trunk between the switches. Okay, DTP is enabled by default into the Cisco switches, which is by default enabled into the Cisco switches. Make sure the DTP has the different kind of mode like access, trunk, and default mode will be either dynamic desirable or maybe dynamic auto itself. When it comes to access and trunk, this is basically the static way of configuring a port to work like access or trunk. They will never change the state until you do manually. Static. When it comes to dynamic desirable, read this. Initially negotiate the message and response to negotiation message to start using trunk. It's like, hello, I want to form a trunk. I want to form a trunk. It will send the message. Dynamic auto, passively wait to receive the trunk negotiation message from the neighbors. So this is basically the different modes you have. Make sure, that's very important, when it comes to the default mode of your port, so they will be in dynamic state only, can be in dynamic desirable or dynamic auto. Most of the switches dynamic auto nowadays. Earlier dynamic desirable was there, depends upon the Cisco series switches. Okay, so this is something about the DTP mode and how exactly you can go ahead and change the mode of your interfaces. See, under interface mode like fast Ethernet 0x0, then switch port mode dynamic auto or maybe dynamic desirable you can define. If you remember, in our previous videos we have discussed like switch port mode, maybe access or trunk, that we have already done. So like that you can change to dynamic auto or dynamic desirable as well. Okay. When it comes to verifications, that's very important. See this. Show interface trunk to verify the trunk, and to know the detailed information about your interfaces, you can go ahead and give this command like show interface, interface type, interface number, and switch port. This command we have already seen in detail. So this is something your DTP, and when it comes to demo, I will show you in the next lecture. And thank you. See you in the next lecture for the demo.